When I grow up, I want that energy. I don't know if I'm grown up right now or I don't know. I don't know. Okay. So moving on with our program. Um, Moving on with our program, we are now moving to. Okay. We are now moving to managing the ESG competency gap, how we can identify skill gaps to our daily practice, how we can identify skill gaps in the boardroom. So, yesterday there was the longest bio that I have read, and today they said so that they should just come. I'll just mention their name and then they will come. So this one time I'm going to call Madeleine from First Rand, South Africa.
Thank you. Good morning. I I have to go after Michael, and I cannot possibly equal his passion and enthusiasm, but I'm going to try. And then I don't really do well with slides. I like just talking from my heart. So let's see how I can get back to the slides just now. So a lot of what I've heard yesterday was that I really respect the fact that Zimbabwe has adopted the ISSB. I think it's really good for the country, and that there's huge opportunity for Zimbabwe to lead on the continent. And I'll be very proud to see the regulatory reporting coming through in a few years' time. The one thing that I am concerned about is that the implementation date seems far away. And I just hope that companies are not waiting until that day when they have to do a readiness assessment and then realize that they are not ready. A lot from what Michael had said is that data and trends and reports come over a period of time. And for you to be able to show how you are progressing, how you're maturing, how you're doing well, you have to be able to draw a trend analysis from one year to the next. So when you eventually disclose, you have valuable information that shows how you've applied those standards in your organization. It's not just about disclosure. If you are going to not do anything until the time that you disclose, whatever's going to come out at the end in your report is going to be absolute greenwashing because it will not be founded in real work. Just to give you context, so I know I was introduced as being part of First Rand, and that's all, I think, always genetically be part of my DNA. But officially, I am now working as an independent, and particularly for ESG Exchange, which is a company that was originated from the work that Professor Mervyn King has done, and the good corporate governance work, the King reports. And the aim specifically is to build capacity, and then particularly within the accountancy world. So that is who I am representing today. But then I'm just going to give examples from my own experience. So when the TCFD came out in 2016, we had the problem to say, okay, so this is yet another voluntary standard. Do we adopt it? Don't we? And that has been the history for the longest time for the banks, particularly for the finance sector, to put up their hands and say, we want to do the right thing. We are already reporting in terms of integrated reporting. We have been producing sustainability reports. We are all listed on the JSE. So we want to be the leaders in doing the right thing. So we formally adopted the TCFD. And when I first looked at the TCFD, it looked like this mountain of work. When I studied, my climatology textbook was about this thick. And I haven't gone back to it yet, but I mean, it's like 100 years ago. We didn't know then what we know today. And it was this huge technical issue. And what I had to do, which was really my job, is an interpreter of scientific data and standards of reporting into business language. And so, what I've spent my whole life doing is taking whatever reporting standards are required and turning it into a business case. Accountants, and particularly bankers, are a tough crowd. So, to sell these concepts to them is quite a difficult thing. So, before climate change, with sustainability, I always joke and say, I think they just kind of accepted that I was the greenie in the organization. Although at the time we had implemented an environmental and social risk assessment process, which was first of its kind in the banks in South Africa, where any person who was a relationship manager or credit manager who had an application for a loan from whichever client had to direct that whole application with all of the details through a filter, people that was trained to do a due diligence. And they would look at adverse media, they would look at legal compliance, they would look at whether all the licenses and permits were in place and so on. And it was all because we wanted to become known as a responsible lender. Through the process, we had also developed some sectors who we would not be financing. So reputationally, we would not want to be associated with them. So for the longest time, First Rand has not financed pornography. Well, obviously prostitution is illegal, but we wouldn't finance that. Anything that is internationally binding, so cross-border waste, high conservation value areas, national monuments, protection, and so on. We wouldn't finance anything that would damage that. But though I was doing this kind of on the ground level, I think in the boardrooms, when I did do my presentation, maybe the board was going, "That's nice, Maddie. You do you. You do your green thing, and we're just going to let you go." And in South Africa, across the road from where we are, we have another bank who have very successfully marketed themselves as being the green bank in South Africa. So, I was told more than once that maybe I should look for a job across the road from where we are, because that's the green bank. And I say this jokingly, they never really made me feel unwelcome. What they did give me, though, was a canvas to slowly but surely, and in my quiet corner, develop a phenomenal team of people who were looking at environmental risk. And so it was this team of mine who congregated around the table, and we had boards up and we were drawing pictures. And we were saying, okay, so how are we going to tackle this climate thing? How are we going to sell it to the board? How are we going to bring it into governance structures? And we were making our little maps and roadmaps and whatever else. But this planning happened in 2016, 2017. Then we started with the basics, the things that we could do. You can always start with the low-hanging fruit. So having the conversation at board level, learning who the supporters are within the organization. For the first time in my career, I now needed different people to help me drive the climate program, and I'll explain that. So I was the only scientist in the entire banking group at the time that I started. So the knowledge sat with me, and it was in my little silo, and I did what I was doing, but kind of on the peripheral of what the business was in the group. When we started studying what was required for climate, we realized that this is a multidisciplined approach. You need the accountants, you need auditors to understand what it's all about. You need the teams that do portfolio management and stress testing and scenario analysis You need them on board. You need them to understand what this is all about. You need them to understand what the potential business impact of climate change is going to be on the company. You need HR to appoint the right people. You need to build capacity. You need sustainability practitioners in the group. But everybody basically has to play a role. And it's only when you get this embedded in the entire DNA of the company, I learned, that you have some success. So it has to become part of what drives the organization and part of their strategy. So the first thing you have to do is to decide, how is climate change going to change my business? How does carbon drive my business? And what can I do about it? And then we also had things like energy security issues, load shedding. And so a lot of the development was basically driven by the need for energy. But it also instilled in the companies the knowledge that they needed energy security. So even today, with Trump jumping up and down and disregarding ESG and diversity and equality, the conversation around the table is not specifically ESG or climate change, but it is building resilience, setting yourself apart, being competitive, being attractive to the global market. I think Karen or somebody mentioned it yesterday as well, is if you want to play in the big leagues, you have to do the right thing. And so energy security, hugely. There's a lot of pressure on all of us to use AI, to digitalize, and that takes a lot more energy. And we already have an energy security issue. So what you do is you have to really invest in renewable energy so that your business becomes sustainable. Competitiveness, resilience, I've said. And then underpinning all of this is people. Not only the people that work for your organization, but the communities in which you provide a service and any community member that may be affected by what you do. So, for example, if the bank lends to a mine and the mine's activities is going to affect not only their own employees, but also the community around that mine, you have to be very careful and consider, and this is where we look at the statistics and the numbers, to say, do we think that the controls that are in place, so the policies, the processes, the training, the skills of the people, is enough of a control to mitigate the risk? And would we then want to be associated with that client? So it's an entire process that happens in the background before we even get to that point. That is from a finance point of view. I have to say that although I was in the risk department, the way that I sold a lot of these concepts was by talking about business opportunities. Now, if you want to get the heads of bankers turned, you have to tell them how they can make money. And so solar products, water solutions, and products that makes companies sustainable, and being innovative, developing these products and taking it to market. And today we have big areas who do sustainable finance only. So the bank has taken some of its own capital, and we attract capital from development financiers, and we use that capital to drive sustainability. So there's a balance sheet, and in that balance sheet, you have your brown sectors, which are becoming less and less. And then you have your green sectors, which are the obvious renewable energy. So that's on the other side of the scale. And then you have the in-betweens, who are the olive. We've called them olive, very fancy. And those are the ones where they're in the brown sector, but they are transitioning. They are building renewable energy. So they're in the process of, or it could be a residential property, which would have just been grey, which is a neutral, because they just dependent on the state-owned entity's energy that's provided to them, which is coal-based. so they can't really do anything about it. So they're blatant users of coal energy. Or you can have the homeowner who changes their entire system at their house to renewable energy and totally lives off the grid. Now, they would be either green if they're totally off the grid, or if they just have solar, they would be olive. Okay, so it's just, but every single transaction gets tagged into that color category. The client as well gets tagged, because you could have a client that has operations throughout the country and in Africa. And so we know exactly what the balance sheet looks like from a green perspective. Now, all of this work happened over the past 7, 8 years. And still, I feel that when we report on TCFD, that there are some things that we can do better. I think we can do more scenario analysis. I think we can stress test better. I think we need to incorporate water as a systemic risk more, because in South Africa and in Africa, water is a strategic risk. And we disregard it, but it's going to become even more critical as a result of climate change. And in Africa, where most of our small practitioners, SMEs, are farmers who do the absolute necessity of providing foods on our tables, are so dependent on climate, and where it's going to become drier and desertous in some cases, it is absolutely critical for us to focus on water. So I'm not yet seeing, some of the things that I imagine are strategic. I've now left the company, but what I think they can still improve on is their transition pathways. How are they going to get to net zero? So they have aligned to the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement says you have to align to net zero by 2050. I think it's a tall order for a developing economy. I'm not quite sure that they can do it. Even China has committed to 2060, India to 2070, and here comes South Africa, we say 2050. But so, I mean, I won't be alive by that time, so I really hope that they stay on this trajectory, because I'm not sure that they're going to make it. But it's critical for us as the world. And the problem is that developing communities and countries like ourselves still need the opportunity to develop. And we basically now catching the last end of the fact that we are being impacted by climate change, and yet we didn't cause all of it. And so, but that's not an excuse, because it affects us globally and everybody has to contribute to it. So I'm really impressed by Zimbabwe for having set their NDC on time and very ambitiously. South Africa's NDC has still not been signed off, and it's not very ambitious. It's going to Parliament in the middle of October, and it's really disappointing. South Africa is hesitant to accept their ISSB standards. They haven't made it mandatory. So they're holding back, and we're sitting and we're thinking, the work that we've done over 20 years long, we're now still doing this all voluntarily. We don't have the regulation. So I've personally been rooting for legislation and regulation for the longest time. And I still feel now at the end of my career, it's there, but it's still not achievable. And that is why I respect Zimbabwe for having accepted it. Because you set yourselves a very high bar, and with all the necessary support that you can get, which I'm sure is available everywhere in your country, but also from an organization like ESG Exchange, I think you can actually do it. But my point is that 7 years of work on a climate management program is still not done. There's still a lot of work to do. I would say continuously up to 2050, there will be a lot of work done. There will have to be trend analysis from one year to the next. The bank's footprint was in 2015, 300,000 tons of carbon. Now, it sounds like a lot, but it's not really, because it's the financial sector and we don't really emit that much. The biggest portion is electricity use. But so the aim, if you're going to net zero by 2050, would be 30,000 tons of carbon, because you may only offset 10% of your carbon emissions if you have a science-based aligned target. So by 2050, we'll still have 30,000 tons of carbon. Now, from a practitioner's point of view, I would have liked that to be net negative, because that is what we need globally to correct, and we can't completely correct it, but at least retain the degrees of increase and global warming. Once again, my point is that if you are having to report in 2028, you have to start doing the work right now. And so directors of companies have certain responsibilities. You all know them, you're all directors. But it's also important in terms of climate change to acknowledge that climate change has an impact and it is financially material to your organization, and that you have to identify capacity constraints in your organization and make sure that you are happy with the capacity and the skills of the people in your organization to be able to manage this risk for you and to give you regular updates on progress. And you have the fiduciary duty to look at ESG issues. So the new thing on the block, and why I have been involved in it, was the task force for nature-related financial disclosure. Now, if you ask me, nature should have come before climate because it's even more critical. And for our continent, nature is absolutely essential for tourism, livelihoods, for food security, for commodities that we use, and I can go forever, and I have mentioned the importance of water. But we're talking about sustainability and we're talking about climate risk for now. So let's just see how much of the slides I've made, just so that you don't have to look at me. Okay, what am I doing wrong? Oh, there. It was just slow. Oh, they're doing it. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm not going to go through all of this because this is what you've been hearing over the last day and a little bit. And just to refresh your memory, so we've been talking about climate adaptation is underfunded. I think in a later slide I say less than 5% of capital to address climate change comes to Africa, where we are the most impacted. Biodiversity loss, we've spoken about poor enforcement of very good laws, but very bad enforcement. Siloed policies, so they are... Am I doing the wrong thing? Ha. Okay, I think we've spoken about inclusion. Yesterday, Hope asked me the question about society and how we include them and how we make sure that whatever we do does not impact society negatively. And she asked me about just transition. And then the other thing that I just wanted to note, so the ISSB standards, so even if you take a leap from the TCFD, so First Round is now well versed in the TCFD, we know it in our sleep, we've got all the process in there, we can tick all the boxes. Here comes the ISSB and it sets yet a higher bar. So if you haven't done any of this, you're actually going to the higher bar first. So it's quite a steep curve. It's like the platinum standard of financial regulatory reporting. And the problem with that is that it's either globally based or world-based, Northern Hemisphere, and like the CSRD is European-based. It's not adapted for Africa, which means that curve is even steeper. Going the wrong way. But I'm excited. And this is why I'm happy to be part of Africa. For the longest time, I've represented the continent at all of these international forums, making sure that we are heard, making sure that our specific biodiversity requirements and the fact that we are very unique on this continent is heard and is taken into account when they write frameworks. The other thing that I'm excited about is that we can do things differently. We can tell our stories differently. So something that Michael said resonates with me, and that is that a report is not um, it's not just a report, telling a story about how your company is performing, how they take ESG seriously. If you are not honest and ethical in that report, you get caught out quite quickly and people lose trust in your organization. And reputation is important to all of us. But this is why it's important not to greenwash, not to put anything in the report that you are not quite sure is the truth, but also always be vulnerable, always tell the story, and not try and impress anybody, but be truthful. And we have the opportunity to do that because the stories in Africa are so unique and we can do it differently. And then the other thing is what I like is that just being here is such a privilege for me because I feel I'm associating with organizations like yours in Zimbabwe. And I hope to do that in Kenya as well. So I'm knocking on Elvis's door so that I can learn because I'm never going to stop learning. I'm always going to learn from other countries that are doing things slightly differently. You know, we were saying that if we look at our peer reports in South Africa, we always go through it with a fine tooth comb and we see, okay, well, what did Nedbank say now that we didn't say? And then we say, oh, this is an interesting way of doing it. Maybe we should, but we are doing it. Let's just tell the story. And the same thing happens with countries. And so what I learn in Zimbabwe is what I will apply in my knowledge base in South Africa and vice versa. ESG Exchange realized is that a lot of companies are doing integrated reporting or sustainability reporting. And now there's this next big thing about the ISSB. And it's quite a lot. You can imagine if IFRS wrote it, it is going to be heavy. For those of you who have implemented any other IFRS 9 or IFRS 17, you know the amount of work that goes into it and the cost attached to it. What is good about this is that the TCFD has laid the groundwork, so some of the work has already begun. What is interesting for me is that the one thing I feel that sets this aside for accountants is accountants generally look at financials from year to year, financial year, or maybe, well, in banks, definitely the view is 3 to maybe 5 years, but that's stretching it because it's so unpredictable. The exchange rate is unpredictable, inflation rate's unpredictable to a certain extent, and growth is very often skewed. So you kind of work in this short period of time. Now, climate knocks all of that out of the water because it looks at a timeline up to 2050. So now we have a problem. We're going to have to sign off on data that hasn't happened yet. So in climate, we use a lot of approximations. We use a lot of forecasting. So the best thing that an accountant can do, an auditor can do, is to say that if we follow this methodology, and mostly we've developed methodology internationally that is accepted as the reasonable methodology to apply to get to the same outcome. So if you audit this type of data, you just kind of have to have a longer term view and you'll have interim targets. So you're typically looking at a 5 to 15 to 20 year horizon, which is just a slight review of what you are used to. But what this company then did is they wrote a module or modules of training for every single person in the organization, whether it's the sustainability practitioner, whether it's just all the employees that need to have a basic awareness of climate change and ESG, whether it is the auditors that have to have very specific training to understand it, whether it is your senior management, and most importantly, whether it's your board. So if you have board scheduled training, climate change should be on that agenda, ESG should be on that agenda, so that all directors understand their fiduciary duty on ESG. And this training is available to do online. So you actually get a certification, a qualification for the training that you've done, and it's self-study. So there's a diploma, so you can actually do the whole lot and get a diploma at the end of it on ISSB. Or you can do parts of it. So there are short courses that have been carved out for whatever role you play in the organization. And basically that is their offering. But it addresses this capacity gap that boards identify and how to get people educated to do this. Now, you can do this by self-study, but then also in facilitated workshops, or they can also help you with writing the policy, writing the controls, actually writing the disclosure, and so on. So the technical support is also there. And I'm just going to go very quickly. So this was stats from 2024, and it showed that there's still a lot of limited ISSB awareness, and that directors are not yet on top of ESG understanding. Let me just ask, the reporting date for the ISSB, do you know when that is? When is the implementation date in Zimbabwe? You don't have one? Okay, all right. And there's no regulators here today, are there? Okay. All right, so that's actually a nice way of doing it, because in Kenya, Elvis tells me that they have implementation dates 2027 for public entities, 2028 for large corporates, and 2029 for SMEs. I feel so sorry for SMEs who have to do all these standards and live up to the compliance. But if you want to export your product to Europe, you have to comply with the standards. And so it's a big leap, and it's a lot of exposure and a lot of cost for SMEs to get there, but it's well worth it in the end. It's almost like Karen said yesterday about the cost that you have to invest to get your carbon credits verified. It's a really steep cost initially, but the more you invest initially, the better it pays off in the long term. So there's definitely a gap in education. And it's particularly about the ISSB standards. Does anybody know what the 4 chapters are of the ISSB? Not? It's similar to the TCFD. So there's a chapter for governance, and this is the one that addresses specifically the board, their understanding, their assessment of capacity in the organization. They're putting in place or instructing the business to give them regular feedback and to provide them with the necessary data for them to make informed decisions. And it's about senior management forming topic-specific committees that address ESG issues. So that's governance, right? Then you have strategy. So now strategy almost follows the initial work, because you have to understand what the impact of climate change is in your business and how your business impacts the environment. And in order to understand that, you have to do some risk assessment and prioritization initially. And you can do that quantitatively or qualitatively, but that will give you an idea. So your strategy will determine your budget. It will determine, once again, an assessment of, do you have the right people in the right places doing the right thing? It will be stress testing your business to see what would happen in the worst case scenario. If you stress test your business, say there was a flood in KwaZulu-Natal recently, and some businesses lost their entire livelihood. They lost all of their stock, all of their machines, and they couldn't produce for a number of months because they were just out of business. So what is the worst case scenario? And actually, it's very sad, but that worst case scenario, which is usually the scenario you imagine that is not quite feasible, it's kind of the worst, actually happened. And as a result, just an example, a larger company, Toyota, their manufacturing plant in KwaZulu-Natal was out of business. They couldn't produce cars. They had losses, damages. Their employees couldn't do work. They had to be reallocated to other parts. And today, there's a civil lawsuit of the insurers of Toyota in Japan against the municipality for not having maintained the stormwater systems and the infrastructure, And they reckon as a result of that, the impact of the flooding was far worse. And so they're suing the Durban municipality, eThekwini municipality, for 6.5 billion rands. And apparently, they're not the only people bringing a suit against the municipality. So, knock on effects, worst case scenario, actually happens today. In fact, it's so sad that when we started doing the work in 2017, these things seemed like medium term. We're actually there, they're already happening. The floods, the droughts, the wildfires. Anyway, let me get back to scenario analysis. That's part of your strategy. Then, business decisions that you make specifically because you now have the data. That's your strategy. The next chapter is risk management, which is basically, I think, the one that comes at the beginning because it's assessing the risk, the materiality of the risk. And in ESG, we talk about double materiality. So yes, it's what is financially impactful for the company. Somebody said yesterday, the definition is, and I can't remember it exactly, but that it's financially material so that if you don't state it, it would have a significant impact on the company. Now, impact materiality is the double materiality part. ISSB focuses a lot on financial materiality, but underlying that is impact materiality. So how big will the impact be if you don't address this issue? And sometimes it may not be financially material, but it could be really impactful and have a very negative impact on the environment. So risk assessment, identifying the risk, identifying the extent of the risk for yourselves. Now, for a bank, this would typically be, so which sectors do I finance that has the most significant impact, that has the highest emissions, and that I should be addressing? And it's typically transport, mining, energy, heavy manufacturing, agriculture, just because it's so vulnerable, but also a high emitter, and so on. So you identify those sectors and you say, okay, caution, when I finance these sectors, I have to take certain elements into account. I may want to, because of my investors, have to limit my exposure to those sectors, and I have to plan transition pathways because the financial institution is also responsible for the emissions of the clients that we finance, as well as our supply chain. So you can imagine it's very difficult to control what you finance, but you do have the financial leverage. And then after having done the assessment, part of your strategy as well is to set risk metrics and targets. Somebody said yesterday, what you don't measure, you don't manage. So setting those targets and then making sure that you make progress towards them. So if you have a net zero by 2050, you have to make plans now to get to that point in 20 years' time. So those are the 4 chapters. It really matters for boards. There's a legal liability for ESG misinterpretation or misrepresentation. There's a lot of court cases about greenwashing. I think we mentioned a few yesterday. There's a lot of investor scrutiny on governance practices, and I believe that's one of the reasons why Zimbabwe put up their hands to say we want to take on this reporting standard because we want to make ourselves more attractive to investors. And I believe that you can actually do that. And then there's regulatory compliance. I'm not going to go through the standards. So ESG Exchange works through the PAFA partnership. And the plan is that with this training that they have available, they want to train 10 million people, 300,000 of those being accountants. So you may hear more about it. And this is just the different levels of training. You have the foundational awareness, and then you have training for executive leadership. You have training in decision making that is strategic. And then you have the whole certification as part of the CPD of an individual. I'm not going to go through the example. You will receive the slides so you can look at the model. You're welcome to contact me if you should have any questions, and I hope that you do. And then, I think the opportunity for Zimbabwe, and as I said, I'm really excited about it, is that it has given you the opportunity to have regional leadership and to be sustainable as a country. And from what I've seen and heard, I think that the potential is definitely here. I am so impressed by all of you and by the country. Commit to continuous learning. I think we're doing that anyway, and this conference is an example. And leading by example, um, and understanding that there is a gap, but there are solutions, and that the opportunity is there for Zimbabwe to grab. And then I honestly believe, and I'd like to close with this, that the ESG story for Africa is not just about catching up, it is about leading differently. And I'm excited, and I hope to be back at other conferences to hear how you've made progress. But you are more than welcome also to contact me if you need any more information. This is a very difficult topic to discuss in a few minutes, but I'm happy to assist if you have any questions during your implementation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. Right now, we are going to just break for our tea for the next 20 minutes, and we are just going to be back here by exactly 10:30 as we just move on. What is going to come next? What is going to come next after that? We have embedding ESG in operational decisions from strategy to daily practice by Valerie Muyambo. And then we move to a comprehensive sustainability just for a few minutes. And then we can discuss on the way forward that you're going to have as we are going out to practice sustainability in our day-to-day professional duties. And we will just have another time also, which will be after lunch, to have some activities and just relax and just stay away from being behind our laptops. And for now, we'll just have 20 minutes to just grab some tea over the restaurant area or the sun area,